relationships or realities. Chapter 2, God is telling His people, I'm going to chastise you, and I'm going to court you all at the same time. In chapter 3, we understand that the thrust is made where Hosea goes and takes his erring wife Gomer back to himself. And then there is the announcement that things are going to befall Israel that are not going to be pleasant, things that they're going to miss, and things that would be instrumental to them if they were devoting and serving themselves solely to God. And then chapter 4, then charges are going to be made. Things are going to be brought up wherein Israel is going to be rebuked for their idolatry, their inhumanity, their failure to devote themselves to God. And so as we were looking last week, y'all remember what we read last week? And I don't know if all the years I've been here that I've ever read publicly the Ten Commandments. I don't know that I have. I looked back through what my files are, and folks, I don't have a sermon per se dealing with the Ten Commandments. And at first that kind of shocked me, but then I thought, why would it? I'm not under the what? And neither are you. Now, I'm to be aware and I am to be knowledgeable to some degree of the Ten Commandments, but I don't have a record of ever preaching a sermon per se on Exodus 20 and the Ten Commandments. So maybe it's time I do one. You know, maybe. But as we think about chapter 4, folks, we read Exodus 20 last week, majority of it, especially the Ten Commandment part. And folks, as we turn our attention to verses 1 through 3 of Hosea chapter 4, then in these 3 verses there are at least 5 of the Ten Commandments that the Israelites are breaking. And they are the last 5 of the Ten Commandments that are found in verses 13 through 17 of the Exodus chapter 20. And so then as you proceed just a little bit further in the book, then you're going to see where they're going to go back and they're going to violate the first of the Ten Commandments. And that's in Exodus 20 and verse 3. Where God says that you are to have what? No other gods before me. And so He is going to rebuke them for their idolatry. And yet He starts out this chapter, as we noted, and He's going to deal with their inhumanity. And I can remember the late Johnny Ramsey as he taught us the minor prophets, and he said that's one of the things that rears its ugly head over and over and over and over again through the minor prophets is their inhumanity to their fellow man. And he said that was one of the most egregious sins that the Israelites were involved in. Folks, I don't know which drove the reality. Were they inhumane to their fellow man because of their idolatrous beliefs? Or did their lack of compassion and their inhumane treatment of their fellow man feed their idolatry? But I know this. When Jesus came, what did He say was the greatest commandment? You are to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, all thy soul, all thy strength. And that is the first and greatest commandment. Matthew 22, verses 36. But then what's a second one that's just If one is number one, then the second one would be 1A. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. You shall love your neighbor. So now, Israel was guilty on both fronts, especially during the days of Hosea. And so, as we noted last week, I believe as we started into this section, and we'll just reread it again to refresh ourselves with it. Chapter 4, verse 1, he says, "Hear the word of the Lord, you children of Israel, for the Lord brings a charge against the inhabitants of the land." Now, anybody have a footnote in this first verse as to what that term charge represents? Do what? Case. Anybody else have anything? Controversy. Okay? If we look at that term charge, and we just look at it, this from the footnote that's found within my Bible. If I can get my eyes to operate. It is identifying a term which means a legal complaint. A legal complaint. So if this was going into a court of law, then if we were to look at it from a lawyer standpoint, common vernacular today, the lawyer would say, we have a what? We have a case. And that's what God is saying. I'm bringing a case, a charge. I'm bringing a complaint. I have a controversy with you, O Israel. Why? Because there is no truth or mercy or knowledge of God in the land. So, by swearing and lying, killing and stealing and committing adultery, they break all restraint with bloodshed upon bloodshed. Therefore the land will mourn, and everyone who dwells there will waste away with the beasts of the field and the birds of the air, and even the fish of the sea will be taken away. Now, as we think about this last thought, and he's been talking about the charge he has, the missing components that should have been prevalent within the land, and I'm not talking about anything other than truth, mercy, and knowledge. Those things were missing. And then he says now, but what has replaced them is what? Swearing, lying, killing, stealing, committing adultery. Does that sound like 10 Commandments being broken? Shall not kill, shall not steal, shall not commit adultery. And then he says now that there's going to be bloodshed upon bloodshed, and then the land is going to suffer. Now in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 15 through 24, God tells them, this is just in part of his dealings with the nation of Israel. Now, somebody briefly put into our thoughts the context of the book of Deuteronomy. What's taking place? A lot of times we get bogged down when we hit the book of Deuteronomy. We just, again. But what has happened? Folks, this is one of the things we got to keep in mind. What has happened when I open the book of Deuteronomy? That nation, or that group of people who were above the age of 20, who had been unfaithful to God when they were going to enter the land at first, they have now what? They're dead. They're gone. So now we have another group of people that are going to enter into the land. Now, not under Moses, but under who? Joshua. And now God, in the book of Deuteronomy, is giving them and is retelling them things that he demands of them when they enter in. So he tells them in Deuteronomy 28 that when you enter into the land, if you do what I tell you to do, if you obey me, then what's the land going to do? It's going to be just like I told you. And how was it in reality? When those spies went into the land of promise and they came out, did God lie to them? Yeah, it was everything and more than what God had told them. How big was the bundle of grapes they were carrying back? Folks, that's not hyperbole. Yeah, it had to be carried on a pole. That's because the land was so fertile. And God said, if you obey me, this is what's going to happen. But because of their disobedience, what did they experience time after time after time? A drought. Because God was doing what? Punishing them, withholding his blessings. Rainfall, non-existent. Famine in the land, something that would happen over and over and over again. And for Israel, it was directly related to their what? Disobedience to God. Now he states this again now to Hosea, through Hosea, and he says now that the land is going to suffer. The beast of the air, birds of the air, the beast of the field, the fish of the sea. This is all going to be taken away. Why? Because there is no truth, there is no mercy, there is no knowledge of God in the land. So therefore, you're going to be punished because of their inhumanity toward their fellow man. Because if they were involved in killing and stealing, then who were they doing that against? Fellow Jews, right? If they were swearing and lying, who were they doing that against? Fellow Jews. Now, if they're involved in adultery, then that would be involved against their fellow Jews and also against God himself, because they turned to what? Idol gods. Therefore, the nation was committing spiritual what? Adultery. So a lot of things are involved in this 3 verses, this context, and yet what God is reminding them through Hosea is this. You have been inhumane to your fellow human beings, but you are not going to get away with it and not suffer. And they were about to suffer. All right, Dale. How many what?
Saviors, so to speak. Moses was one.
Yeah.
But what has God done? And when we sit here and we start in Genesis and we go to Revelation, we go to creation, you might say to Christ, to being in heaven. You can say that thing. But when we look at and study this, we need to study this when it's not just what some of these pagans, but combine this with what's on down the road in the New Testament. See, how has God dealt with these people time and time and time again? Now, how is God going to deal with us? No, he's not going to do the same things that he's talking about here. But in essence, he will, as far as spirituality is concerned.
Right.
So then we have absolutely will have no excuse come judgment.
No.
Whatsoever. None whatsoever. So we have thousands of years of testimony and writings to tell us what has taken place. So don't do it again. Don't do it anymore.
Yep.
But we do.
Yep.
And
We do.
said it.
Anybody else? Yes, Miss Jamie. Right. And that's a good point because, we have Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, and go on and on. And every one of these prophets has a particular audience in mind. And yet, Hosea and Amos are both directed where? To the nation of Israel. Same group of people. And yet, as Jamie brought up, here it might be in a kind of a broad way as he's addressing these charges, but then in the book of Amos he gets more particular. And so as we think about these wonderful books that we have to study, they're not just for us to just study so that we might have head knowledge. They're written for our learning, and then how do I know if I really learned something? Okay. Change takes place. I do better or I do different. And now that's learning. Okay. And so as we think about verse 4 going on now, he says, Now let no man contend or rebuke another. For your people are like those who contend with the priest. Therefore you shall stumble in the day. The prophet also shall stumble with you in the night, and I will destroy your mother. And so the mother here is going to be representative of the entire nation. And the prophets and the priests, they are going to be those who were, the prophet, when he came and spoke, he spoke to the people for whom? For God. But now the priest, what was his place? He spoke to God for the people. Okay? So the priest was that one that was the means whereby they would go to God. Their sacrifices, if there wasn't a priest, then what? You don't offer them. So he was their means to go to God. And that's the really a great point that's brought up in the 4th chapter of the book of Hebrews, where it talks about Jesus as our great high priest. He's our means now to go to God. And so then as we think about the charges that are being brought here, he says, do not contend or rebuke another. Don't contend with the priest. Therefore you shall stumble in the day. The prophet is going to stumble right there with you, and I will eventually destroy your mother. The nation is going to be destroyed. Now, verse 6, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, in verse 6. Now, because you have rejected knowledge, I also reject you from being priests to me. Now, folks, this reminds me of what Paul says over in the 13th chapter of the book of Acts, when Paul is on that first missionary journey and he comes to the Jews and they're trying to have a receptance from the Jewish people concerning the gospel and everything. And what does Paul state concerning the Jews? In verse 46 of Acts 13, he says, seeing you have judged yourselves unworthy of the gospel. The Jews, for the most part, what did they do to the gospel message that Paul brought? They ignored it, rejected it, and not only that, they were not just content to reject it or ignore it, but what did they try to do to Paul on those occasions? Okay, if they'd had their desires, they would have killed him. But they rejected the gospel, and because they rejected the gospel, judged themselves unworthy of the gospel, now Paul says, I'm going where? To the Gentiles. So now he begins that thrust, and now he did not totally abandon his Jewish kinsmen, because Paul's attitude toward his Jewish kinsmen was always what? My heart's desire and prayer for Israel is that they may be saved. Yeah. Take the opening verses of Romans 9 and Romans 10, and you get a clear picture of how Paul felt toward his fellow Jews. I would be cast away if they could be saved. Now think of the depth of that statement. Paul said, I'd be willing to spend eternity where? In hell. Lost, if my Jewish kinsmen could be saved. If that's the means whereby they could be saved, I would be willing to do that. But it wasn't. But he bemoans the fact that in chapter 10, he says, I bear them record they have a what? Zeal for God, but it's not according to truth. Being ignorant of God's righteousness, they have set about or gone about to establish their own what? Righteousness. But here in the book of Hosea, Hosea says, my people are destroyed. God, through Hosea, says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, because you have rejected knowledge. I will reject you from being priest for me. Because you have forgotten the law of your God, I will also forget your children. Now, what's one of the things that the law, what were parents instructed to do with their children concerning the law? Everything they did was to be an exposure to what? The law. When you're walking by the way, do what? Talk with them. When they're lying down, what do? Talk with them. When they're rising up, what do? You talk with them. They were to teach statutes and ordinances and laws to their children. Well, here, because you've forgotten, because you have forgotten the law of your God, I will what? Forget your children. Verse 7. The more they increased, the more they sinned against me. This period that we're talking about here was a period wherein Israel as a nation, they were prospering greatly. Materially, financially, they were doing very well. But the more they increased, the more they what? Sinned. Folks, we've got to be extremely careful, even in the 21st century, to not allow materialism to do what? Pull us away from God. You remember, and so much of this is just so applicable. You remember when they were getting ready to enter into the promised land and Moses told them, you need to be careful. Because when you enter into what? Houses you did not build, vineyards you did not plant. He goes on through a list of things where he talks about these are things you're just going to come in and it's going to be there. Why? How is that going to be possible? They drove those inhabitants out of the land. Well, when they drove them out, if they had a vineyard, if they had houses, they had lands, they just moved in and took up what? Residence. And he says, now you need to be careful when you do this, lest you what? Forget me. Because what would be the tendency? They go in, they drive out this whole group of people, whoever it might be, a Hivite, a Hittite, a Jebusite, whoever it might be, they're driving them out. They go into the city, and then what's the tendency? Yeah, look what I did. When in reality, how were they even able to drive these people out? With God's help. Yeah. And folks, what would certainly should serve as a reminder to them? What two cities that are right close to one another in our Bibles, at least anyway, and just geographically. Do what? Jericho and Ai. Jericho was a large, intimidating, impregnable city. How'd they take it? Loaded their cannons up and fired cannon shots in there? Yeah. They marched around the city as God so instructed them to. When it got to the appointed time, they blew on trumpets, and what happened? Walls fell in. Fell in. Now, what was the commandment? When you take the city, now what? Don't take anything out of the city. Well, old Achan was pretty soon going to be what? Achan. And so he takes it and he hides it under the tent floor and everything, thinks he's hidden it. And then they go up and they're going to go to this relatively small podunk place called Ai. And they get soundly what? Thrashed. They are thrashed. They come back, and the only thing they can draw is what? What's the only conclusion? Why is the only reason this could be happening? What was in the camp? Sin was in the camp. So Achan and his family, they pay the price. Well, notice, the more they increased, the more they sinned against me. Ben?
Verse 7 there, with their increase, if we go back to Acts 2:47, praise God and having favor with all people, the Lord asked the church Gaius should be saved. Our increase is God showing us favor, so we need to use it in the correct way. And we know from the time they left Egypt, he was always showing them favor, but they didn't see it.
Right, right. And you know, a lot of times even God's good favor, they moaned and complained about it.
What kind of people were they? They got it up, their clothes didn't wear out, and all. Well, they had water. So, it's hard for me to understand.
Well, I'm going to tell you exactly what kind of people I think they were. They were unmindful. I wonder how many of them got up every morning and went out there and picked up their quota of manna and never once gave a single thought to the God of heaven who put it there. They were unmindful of whom? God. And then that unmindfulness turned into what? Forgetfulness. And then that forgetfulness turned into what? Immoral, ungodly practices. They forgot who they were. They were God's people. They forgot to give thanks unto God. And then they knew they were being blessed and God was blessing them, but they attributed that to whom? The idol gods of their making. And so then we see where now he says in a very sullen in a very serious way, the more they increased, the more they sinned. Stan? Well,
Let me give you an example. God provided every physical need they needed. God expected back from them spiritually. I don't want to get on the denominational thing because it's leading into the church itself. But let's just go to the denominational church this morning. Bust open the doors. What do you smell? Cinnamon, Starbucks. We're going to bring you in with the physical and we're going to convert you to spiritual. It don't work that way.
no.
It don't work that way. It's been proven over and over and over for centuries and centuries.
Right.
And when you start out, open the door, I smell Cinnabon and Starbucks, and you teach the children that it's okay for Cinnabon and Starbucks to be with them and in the classroom with them, what do they think about when they go to class? I'm getting Cinnabon and Starbucks. I'm not getting spiritually blessed. That's what they do. It's a psychological thing, and it's just like in the Old Testament. It takes generations. And some of us are not young enough or old enough to know what a generation is. But like in Deuteronomy, some of us, when God said, you're out. These people, you got nothing to do with them for 4 generations or 10 generations. That's a long time, so that they can forget what they learned from this perversion place that they went. And that's America today. That's what we're doing today in the world, and it's leaking into the church as we speak.
And one
If you don't believe it, go from the smallest churches that are more, I would say, conservative, more like what it was 50 years ago, to the more liberal churches, and just, now we can sing and play music, and we can have women in the, see how it works? It's just a little bit. Bring Cinnabon and Starbucks in, and we'll bring all these people in because we're going to bless them with what they want that morning.
Yep.
They want to wake up.
instead of making the church more spiritual, we're bringing the world into it.
Well, and that's just something, folks, what have I always told you from the, I guess maybe the first year I was here? How far is the church behind the world? About 20 years. About 20 years.
But the church is something different from anything in this world.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, we are people. People are people, and so then we're going to be about 20 years behind the world. Well, folks, there were things that were taking place 20 years ago. And folks, how long ago was that? Yeah, I mean, but the reality is, we're somewhere 20, 25 years behind the world. In the church. We fight it, we resist it, but then it just, because, well, we have to really, and I think we do, but then what happens in that 25 years? Folks, if we're fighting something from coming in right here, right now, if we're 25 years and it actually coming in, then Walker is going to be 26 years old. Ivy's going to be 26 years old. And so if that's what's happened is that, folks, how many of us in this room think we're going to be here 25 years from now? Not many of us. Well, another generation comes up. Another generation comes up. Well, what did Israel fail to do? They failed to teach their children, and we have that charge, do we not? Teach our children the way they should go. So we've got to make sure each generation is being equipped. Now, just because something was done 50 years ago doesn't mean it was biblically wrong. Okay? That doesn't, 50 years ago doesn't make that wrong or right. What makes it wrong or right is the Bible. Folks, there were things that we never did when I was a kid growing up. There wasn't a biblical precedent. There wasn't a biblical scripture that says don't do this. But why did we not do it? Because the elders where we were, they said we're not going to do this. But if they had been pressed, they couldn't have said, well, we're not doing this because the Bible says don't do this. So just because something's old doesn't mean it's what? True or right. Or that if we do something today that they didn't do 50 years ago, that it's inherently wrong or sinful. All right, we got Eric, and then we'll come back to Stan.
You talk about Israel when they got to go into the land. They were, like Angie was telling me, it
No.
God give it to them, everything. And all that they seen when they traveled out for 40 years, why did they not, they should have remembered that. And then when you go back to David and Goliath, what did David tell that listening? He said, today the Lord is going to give you into my hand.
Right.
It wasn't David that did it.
No.
David put it back where it was supposed to be.
Right.
If Israel wouldn't do that, they wouldn't put it back in God's hands and say, this is God's providing this. So, and for me today, how quick can I slip off into that same mentality if I don't hold fast to this Bible?
True. All right, Dan.
It's short. It doesn't make it right because it was that way 50 years ago, but the Bible is a book of history.
Sure.
It's for us to learn.
Yeah.
The Jews never incrementally got better.
No.
They incrementally got worse because they're human beings.
Right.
We are the same as they are. We are not incrementally going to get better.
No.
As our custom goes, what we think about the wrong, if it's what we think. And that's what was 50 years ago may not be right, but if you go
Yeah, yeah. I agree. Go past Jeremiah 6 and verse 16. Yeah, I agree. But, as I restated, just because it's what we did 50 years ago,